and thank you so much for helping judge that. Aparna, I'd like to start with you. You heard the kids talking today. What did you take away from them in terms of what are the stories that they like to hear, the stories they like to read, the stories that they like to tell?
I think it was pretty interesting because we had, I think, kind of a, what shall I say, a difficult choice that we placed before them. Two very popular authors, as Rituparna said,
Right.
and between them, it's quite hard to choose. And it's a very, what shall I say, notional divide by saying that it's contemporary and this is, from the past.
Right.
But it's not quite that, right? We are talking to people who are telling the stories that we think people want to hear, whereas we are missing out on the processes of our time.
Right.
Chetan talks about a certain kind of process, and I think he makes a very, what shall I say, a very good job of doing that. But we are seeing so many more churns around our country at this point. Are we debating enough? Are we, dealing enough with those churns? And do these two authors really represent that churn? The great processes. If you look at COVID-19, what happened? The collapse of so much of infrastructure. If you look at the great inequalities, some of that comes in, of course. But if you look at, invisibilized labor, if you look at women, so you can cherry pick and take the easy points and talk to them. And I think it's very easy to relate to those books because they don't draw you in or make you think that deeply. So would they be the, what shall I say, the bellwether? Would they be the deciding factor? I don't know. I don't know if that would, give me enough to say that, is this what India is relating to? But from today, yes, I think it is. It seems like a very superficial debate where we are collapsing the complexities and we are saying it's either about today or about the past.
Right. It isn't so simple.
It isn't. It isn't.
Sridala?
Yeah.
I wasn't there for the entirety of the debate, but from what I could hear, it's interesting that debates are structured in such a way that you have to answer what you've been given to talk about. So, it's possible that they had different viewpoints,
That's
but
right.
within
I
the
often
structure
think
of
that,
the debate, they have to answer or rebut or talk about what they've been given to talk about. Because 3.5 minutes, 2.5 minutes, and one rebuttal is not enough to give you the complexity of the issue. But given that, I think there was a decent variety of opinion within the range of their experience and their reading, which is commendable.
Yeah. Talking about range of experiences, Aparna, you've traveled so deeply into, Tamil Nadu especially, with all the reporting that you've done for Pari. What are those stories that you hear? And, do you see that diversity and that brilliance reflected, when you come to urban areas, when you come to English, or even when you come to reading Tamil literature? Do you see that brilliance being reflected?
In Tamil literature, sure.
Yeah.
In parts of, I think, Indian journalistic tradition, yes, of course. What I think is missing is this great disconnect between the art, the artist, and the consumer. Okay, so I think, the sari that I'm wearing, or, what you are wearing, what she's wearing, all of this comes from great traditions.
Yeah.
The everyday aesthetics that people kind of coded into our art. We don't appreciate the artist enough, I
Right.
think. One way of, journalism is that you are trying to bridge that gap between the art, the artist, the consumer, and making people see what is so easily invisibilized. Why is this a problem? Because you have hierarchies in India. You have the hand versus head hierarchy, where you have anything that is, the head versus hand.
Yeah.
You have anything that is intellectual getting paid more,
Right.
getting much more visibility. Like, why are we sitting here and talking about this and not the actual people who are doing the jobs,
Yeah.
putting the food on the table or getting these saris or, anything that's beautiful out there. Why are they not here? It's because we value a certain kind of, let's say, a knowledge as the one that, we want to showcase and present. So my job is to see that we break some of those hierarchies where there is gatekeeping, and if I get an opportunity to see if I can push in somebody else's voice, not necessarily my voice.
That's what's so lovely. I think that we should at least try and reflect other voices
Yes.
apart from our own.
Yeah.
Sridala, your poetry obviously informs your other writing as well. How does it inform
Uh, Actually, it's the other way around. It's everything else that informs the poetry.
that? Right.
Because I think it's the poetry that's the constant, and all the other things that I do are varied. You know, sometimes I'm a photographer. Sometimes I used to be once upon a time I used to be a film editor. Uh, I have written for children. I've written journalism. So it's the other things that inform the poetry rather than the other way around. But I think
So you're at heart a poet, and then everything else.
I hesitate to say I'm at heart anything because tomorrow I will change my mind about that. So let's say currently in my heart I'm a poet.
Right.
Yes.
So when you look at the literature that's available, I know you've written Chinu's Gift, and you've written. I love that idea of Kali wants to dance, right? So these are people we've seen or we've heard of, stories that we can relate to. But of course, I mean, I come from a generation that grew up on, Enid Blyton's, and I'm older than you guys. But what have we missed out, and do you think we're able to connect our children or the ones that will follow to our traditions and to our storytelling? Because we had to wait for the Ramayana and Mahabharata in 86, 87 for it to come on screen before some of us, who were called the deracinated crowd, actually understood the importance of these stories.
You know, I'd like to just share a thing somebody said to me. The Community Library Pro in Delhi, Mridula Koshi had copies of Chinu's Gift among the books in the
Right.
library. And she said some of the feedback from the actual readers was, this is the first time I'm seeing a kabadiwala
Yeah.
represented in a story for children.
And in such a positive way, without any,
Yes.
because kabadiwalas are like the.
Yes. So when we talk about tradition also,
Yeah.
I want to say that while a kabadiwala or our way of recycling things traditionally is something to be, celebrated in a sense, it also, that work itself is never pleasant.
Yeah.
And the people who do it never find themselves in stories. They never find themselves on screen, never find themselves talked about. And as you said, often not positively.
Yeah.
They might just be a background to something else that's
Right.
happening. So I think there's something to be said for finding the things that don't often catch the eye of people.
Right.
Like all the people in Aparna's books.
Yeah.
You eat that panavellam, you play that drum, you use those objects.
Yeah.
But there is a whole lived experience behind it, and you never see it.
Right.
Because all of those people are invisibilized in order to celebrate the tradition. So
Yeah.
you celebrate the object of that tradition, but you don't celebrate the people who produce those objects.
Very well said. We love to talk about our culture of recycling and reusing and upcycling, which has all become very fashionable. And yet, when a kabadiwala becomes the hero of the story, and his son and he become the hero of the story, we will often find children who've grown up in gated communities who may not even have seen a kabadiwala, in their lives. So that invisibilization that you're talking about is actually a daily process. It's happening. I mean, professions are just disappearing before our eyes, right? So how important is it that you are able to represent them correctly?
So I think the first thing is not romanticize the
Yeah.
profession. Yeah, and also recognize that my culture is the history of somebody else's oppression.
Yeah,
That was the penny drop moment for me.
that's true. We
so-
forget that.
Yeah, yeah. And also that some of these professions are not necessarily aspirational, I think.
Yeah.
Like the kabadiwala or like, many of the forms that I have in my book. They're not livelihoods that are aspirational because you're caught within a caste and class vortex
Yeah.
and a gender vortex. How do you break out of it? How does society, only choose to engage with the culture, only choose to engage with the art, but not the people, the livelihoods? Why they are, often doing the livelihoods? My daughter is not entitled, or my daughter's not going to be forced to take on my occupation.
Right.
Journalism with all its trappings, it's fun, it's great to do and all of that, but it has its own challenges. She's not going to have to inherit this work, but you have generations of people doing that work. So why don't we find these stories out there? It's because people think it's not sexy enough.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, if I go and pitch a 5,000 word story about a woman salt maker in Tuticorin to a newspaper or a website, am I going to get the space to, tell that story? I'm not. So I'm
Unless
lucky.
there is something there that is, appealing to someone.
So, I'm lucky that I have, a grant. I'm lucky that I have a platform that will take these stories in the way that I want them to,
Right.
with the integrity, and I have an editor who appreciates that. But it's not going to happen all the time, right? So when the story is out there, everybody likes it. But how do you get the story
Yeah.
out there? I mean, do we have the resources? Do we have the spaces for that? I think that's going to be our actual real debate. Like you said about the Ramayana, has the time come for Indian stories? I think Sridala and I were talking about this. Yes, I mean, absolutely. JCB Prize is full of translations,
Yeah.
which means that Indian language stories are
Are being
selling,
read.
right?
And
In-
selling.
yeah, and everybody wants to access them in English, right? So we do have like a vibrant translation thing going now. But are we having the space to, report on these everyday happenings, on the everyday people in newspapers, in popular media? I don't know.
Yeah. So the challenge is that this remains a very small niche kind of storytelling. How do we popularize it?
I'm not sure. I think, I keep thinking cinema used to be the way to do
Yeah.
that once upon a time. And I think before liberalization, there were more diverse stories being told in terms of, like, if you just saw the professions of people, whether they were factory workers or whatever it is, there were just more diverse storytelling opportunities at that time. I think it's a question of, when you begin to cater to an audience, then you narrow your storytelling to fit what you perceive to be the audience. But if you do not tie yourself to who you imagine your audience is, but write what you want to write,
What you want to.
perhaps it will find its audience.
Right.
After all, Gitanjali Shri's book just won the Man Booker
Yeah.
Prize. And until it won the prize, nobody knew that they wanted to read those stories.
Or
But
nobody
it's
knew of
there and-
Gitanjali, poor woman.
Indeed. So, you just write what you want to write.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes the stories find their audience regardless.
Right.
And I'm sure, I wasn't here yesterday, but I'm sure Manoranjan Baipari's stories, for instance, until it happens, you don't know there is an audience for it. So I think instead of trying to back end the story by writing from a marketing perspective of who you think the audience is, just write from a writer's perspective and then you will find your audience.
Yeah. So when you wrote Kali Wants to Dance or a Woof, which I find very sweet, and your
Cat's
cat
egg,
story, so
yeah.
cute. What were you thinking? Is this the kind of thing that will work, or this was just something that you wanted to write?
I think I completely agree with Sridala. It's just what, I end up writing what I want to read. And I've just got lucky that, I've had the spaces to do that. And, Sridala and I were discussing.
Often when when you have kids, you write to entertain your kids, and then it's if they like it, other kids will like it.
What do you talked about a daughter, so I presume that
She's 24, so she's...
okay, so she's way beyond.
But she's my first reader, my beta reader. Like
Right.
the person who's like, getting to read the worst of the drafts and like, it's like, Mummy, it's okay, it'll get better from here.
And how important is it for you to find that perfect illustrator? I often think that illustrators are so under sort of appreciated because they really do add the magic to your words, don't they?
Absolutely. I mean, I was lucky in that Sushila's columns had Priya Korean, who's an amazing.
I think she's the
children's
goddess of
illustrator. Yes.
illustrated.
But even the other books by Pratham, or if you look at Nilanjana Roy's Wildings,
Yeah.
the drawings in that, when you tell a story for an audience that's moving slowly from a pictorial depiction
Yeah.
into a fully word-based story, it's very important to draw them in with the pictures, because I think their imagination is so broad and
Yeah.
so unrestricted at that age that the pictures allow them to make something else of the story altogether.
They also might not be, they also might be the first learners of English in their family, right? So how important is that? Because that graduation also has to be made, and the parents should not feel completely out of that conversation with the children, right?
I think whether it is an adult or a child, when we're talking about English language, I think it's really. So, when I wrote this book, for example, I look at much of my reporting work or writing as an act of translation.
Right. Yeah,
Because it
actually,
is,
yes.
it is
It
because it's
is.
done in Tamil and
Yeah.
then all the interviews, and then I write it in English. And just by the act of writing in English, and I'm collapsing a lot of dialects into one dialect, which is, available to me in English. So that is itself an act of erasure, right? I
Yeah.
am erasing somebody else's dialect. And in that process, removing words which are regional, which are local. So whether it is a child or it is an adult, when they come and read something that I have written, they are reading it in an alien tongue.
Yeah.
Automatically, right? So for a child to first read a book in English, I think it can be quite intimidating.
Aparna, actually, I did want to ask you, do these stories that you've written about these people go back to them as the completed stories? How
Yes.
do they, so Pari translates, I know
Yeah,
that.
Pari
So they are
translates.
able to see what you've written about
Yes,
them.
and what we do is when I do write them as well, call up the people repeatedly and ask them if I have accurately said what they wanted to say by retranslating it back into Tamil, just so that there is nothing lost
Lost in
the
translation.
yeah.
Yeah.
But for a child, I think it is very intimidating whether it is reading any book, and I think pictures, as she said, really does bridge that gap. And one thing that I did want to bring up with Sridala was related to what you were asking, is how we don't see so much of contemporary poet in textbooks, unless I'm missing something. At least when my daughter went to school, there wasn't so much contemporary poems. So would that also be something intimidating for a child? I mean, one is of course accessing it in English and accessing Milton and Keats.
Yeah.
Not, something that happened.
Yeah, I think, I've forgotten my own experience of it, and I know that my son went to schools where, regardless of what the syllabus taught you, there were people who were teaching poetry. So I think I'm the wrong person to ask about a textbook approach to how poetry is taught in schools. But I think there has been some attempt to include some contemporary Indian poets
Yeah, but
in
it stops at
syllabuses.
Nissim Ezekiel, at the Night of the Scorpion type.
Yes, there will be
It
a
doesn't
Nissim
go
Ezekiel
beyond that.
or a Give Patel.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there are about 4 or
It's-
5 poems you will
yeah.
know, and that's about it.
Right.
But I
it
think,
still remains pretty much what we grew up with, except and also the whole idea of daffodils and things like that, which, I mean, even now I actually cannot recognize a daffodil. I'm very sorry.
I mean, I
say.
have to say, I don't know what a scone is. So there we are.
Exactly. But we read about these words, and if they're alien to us and foreign to us, I can't imagine the little child sitting in a little school
But I
somewhere.
did want to say about that is that, there is no person who encounters a story who doesn't want to claim the world in the story for themselves and thereby making the world a larger place for
Right.
themselves. So we grew up in an India where, and actually an Enid Blyton is an alien presence, the stories
Yeah.
that they tell. But I mean, until I ate an actual cold hard-boiled egg, which is disgusting, I thought that was an amazing thing to take with you on a picnic,
Yeah.
and that didn't matter because your
It's the
imagination made something
imagination of
amazing
it.
of it.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter if something is Indian or not. If it opens up the minds of a person reading that book,
That's true.
whether it is an Indian detail or something you've never encountered, it exists as something in your memory until you do encounter it. At this age, I have not eaten a scone, but one day I will, and I will relate that to everything that I've ever read, including this session, and that will be great.
Yeah.
I just have one small point about that. I think it's like if you're reading widely and a real
Aparna,
varied
just
thing.
put the mic a little
yeah.
closer.
I
Yeah.
think if you're reading widely in a very varied sense, then it's okay. But if you are going to be limited to a few books, are these books representational enough?
Yeah.
Are we, speaking back to ourselves? Are we celebrating? Like I said, for
That's
me,
absolutely
you
true.
know, it's just that, when we have a chance, when we have, say, somebody, to give somebody 5,000, 7,000 words and say, this is your non-detailed text for this year, do you want that to reflect, us, as in like the now us? Because then we, tell people, you have no idea what's happening in the world. You are getting your information from WhatsApp. So there is also that argument, right? And the one way to set that argument right is to actually give people the correct narratives. And correct is, of course, always subjective. I'm not saying that there is one version of correct, but at least as far as possible, talk about the people that they would otherwise not encounter, like you said, in the gated communities or whatever. When people have a chance to read 10 books, can we slip in this one as,
Yeah.
something reflective, something that they should reflect on? So,
Yeah.
That is absolutely true. I agree. I think your position and your privilege allows you access to a whole lot of things. And that enlargement may not be possible for a lot of people. So it is necessary also to have the kind of stories that make them feel seen and feel like they belong in this world of books. If you're alienating them to such an extent, if you're alienating a reader to such an extent that they don't see themselves at all in the literature that they're reading, then they will just not read it.
Of course, the big challenge is getting them to read in the first place, isn't it? Is that still a big challenge?
I mean, from kids' books, I think there is a lot of interest. So I hear these two arguments, one that people only read a certain kind of literature,
Yeah.
and that children don't read at all, and then they're only consuming things, through visual media.
Yeah.
But I also see very, committed readers who actually write back and tell you how the story spoke to them. So you see a bit of this variance, just like with older people. I saw this tweet yesterday, which sort of broke my heart, which said that writers are a small community of people who beg each other to read the book, but then don't read anything beyond tweets. Who don't read anything beyond tweets? Okay, so
That's quite
rude. Isn't
yeah,
it?
it's apart from everything else.
Yeah.
But the whole idea that we're living in this world where there's so much information, people are just so jaded. Yet, does it has someone told you things about your story which have surprised you, or which for instance, when you talked about Chinu's gift, the fact that they've never seen a kabadiwala being represented, has something sort of struck you like that, and you said, "Wow"? Is there been like a wow moment?
I mean, that was my oh wow minute in a sense. And also, I'm always pleasantly surprised when people, recently on Twitter, somebody asked me permission to translate my poems into Kannada.
Wow.
He said, I've been trying to get in touch with you for a long time. I've been wanting to do it. And most of the poems that he translated were from my first collection, which is no longer in print, which you will never find in a bookstore. You might not even find in a second-hand bookstore. But somehow he had got a copy of it and he translated this poem. And I was really touched because it's been 14 years since that collection. And there is someone who cares enough about that poetry who wants to share it in another language with his readers. So it's always unexpected when you find a reader. You were saying, do we have readers? They're there, and they want to share that.
Yeah.
And it's amazing.
Aparna?
It's happened, yes.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Tell
but,
me about it.
I think Kali Wants to Dance has traveled quite a bit,
Yeah.
and to book clubs and schools, and it's become this book where young underprivileged students, particularly, when they want to dance, and they're very hesitant about it.
Boys.
They see this boys, girls, they see this little young man with brown skin who looks like them, who is a dancer, who's a celebrated dancer, who's an award-winning dancer, right? That gives him hope. So that gives him something. And Woof has actually made a lot of people adopt indies, which I'm thrilled
Which is
about.
so lovely.
Yeah.
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 Great. Do we have questions from the crowd, or can I ask you to please, maybe read from your book, and perhaps you'd like to read a poem, or
I'll read a poem.
yeah,
So let me
maybe
see.
from the one that's not available, or is this?
Oh, I don't have that. But I mean, I can recite a poem from that. That's not
Yeah.
a problem. So this one is called Shelter. Strength comes from within. I want to be like a tree on which the birds rest, but when they fly away, there is no pain. Just the peace of the air, the feel of the wind on my leaves, which drop when the seasons change with no regret. And maybe I'll read one
Please,
from
please.
this collection. I'm reading this poem called Hunger Stones, which for a long time I saw this. I think you'll have seen this on social media recently with climate change and everything. You'd have seen this news of these stones under the river in Germany, which emerged after a long time. And on it was carved the words which translated say, "When you see this, then weep," because it meant that things were so dire that the stones appeared.
Okay, wow.
Okay, so they're called hunger stones. And for the longest time, I had that with me, but I didn't have a poem. And when the pandemic happened, and there was a sudden lockdown, and then people were finding their way back home, somehow it just clicked into place, and this poem came out of that. So it's called Hunger Stones, and the epigraph in German is "Wenn du mich siehst, then wein," which is "when you see them, then weep." Hunger stones. The stones appeared, after all, but they were not under the ground or revealed gradually in a slow, creeping disaster no one noticed until it was upon them. Suddenly they were there. They dragged at the feet of children crying to be picked up because they'd walked too long on too little. Men and women, young and old, carried stones for rations as they walked back to a place they called home. When the stones appeared, the people were cleaved. It was the hunger. It was vast, vast as the stores of grain hoarded against just such a day people long ago prepared for, but now that day had arrived, the hoard had turned to rot. The stones appear when the living can no longer imagine even the present. When you see them, then weep.
Wow. Thank you.
Thank you.
Aparna?
Sure. I'd like to read a very small passage.
Sure.
From this story called 50 Feet Above. It's about the palm tree climbers of Tamil Nadu and how they make palm jaggery, and which is something which I've always enjoyed as a treat and also in sweets. But the labor is terrible. So I'm just going to read a small bit from that. This is about a lady called Muniamma, who is from this district called as Ramanathapuram. On a good day, Muniamma stuck inside the hut for at least 9 hours, boiling up 3 batches of karapatti. Karapatti is palm jaggery. Every minute she's inside, bent over or crouched next to the wood fire, she's breathing in fumes. Her face is scorched and her eyes smart and tear up. None of my sisters were married to palm tree climbers, she said, sighing and stirring. My parents did this work. I was the 4th daughter. My sisters' husbands work on salt pans, but they got me married to him, she pointed outside, where Rajendran, her husband, was cutting palm fronds. Despite her angst, she did not once curse her job. Invited to talk about the process in her routine, she spoke at length about the upkeep of the mud stove. With hands darkened by fire, she patted and rubbed the air. This is how she applies cow dung on the stove to smoothen the sides, and this is how she keeps it from cracking from the heat of the burning firewood. What about you? I asked. She wiped her face with the edge of her synthetic sari and continued to stir the padanir. I'll stop there.
Yeah, just one more, if I'm not being greedy.
No, sure. As the sap boiled inside a 4-foot wide aluminium pan over a waist-high firewood stove set deep in the ground, Muniamma poked with a palm frond at the fizzy, frothy hat that rose to the top, and it obediently settled back into the pan. Earlier, she had picked out ants and bees with a muslin cloth off the surface of the freshly tapped padanir. Now and then, she added half a pinch of castor seeds. Sometimes it is a drop of coconut oil to keep the padanir from boiling over. She kept an eye on the fire beneath at all times, adjusting the heat by adding to or arranging the wood. The liquid became a syrupy caramel, and the hut was scented with a sharp, sweet smell layered with that of wood fire. As it thickened, her strokes got heavier, as if she was trying to row in a sea of brown custard. She poured some of the scoocharu, just a stage away from becoming karupatti, into a plated palm leaf bowl and offered it to me. The warm, sweet liquid soothed my throat, but the memory of her labor is bitter.
So much detail in two little passages of so much labor. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Yeah, quickly. Is there a question? Quick.
Both of you talked about how literature can be made more accessible by introducing characters who are rooted in various cultures that we have in our country. How do you think we can make such an infrastructure which will help us, introduce such characters, like various different kind of characters, so that like kids and everyone is aware about it from like smaller.
What do you mean
Yeah.
by infrastructure?
Infrastructure as in how can we make people more aware that there are more, like people are stuck in their own worldview, so how can we make it like how can we
Yeah,
help
I mean,
them?
I think do you mean libraries or
Yeah,
things like
something
that,
like that maybe.
which can actually allow people to step out of their bubbles? I think it's a very noble idea, but how do you do it? Can we just leave everything to the state? If some things have to be done by the community as
No, of
well.
course not. And that includes, people who should be looking for diverse stories.
Yeah.
The thing also is that the easiest thing to do is to find something that you already like and then keep finding more of it.
Right.
But I think it's also up to each reader to kind of find something different than what you usually like, and stay patient while you go through it, because it's not immediately to your taste. So it takes a little time for you to get used to it. But stick with it is the work. Ultimately, you can get all the support from libraries, from the state, from people bringing everything to you right into your hands. But ultimately, you're the one who's got to have to read and stick with it.
Aparna?
I think there is a lot happening in some sense. Like if you look at Karnataka rural libraries, Uma Mahadevan, I think she's doing a fantastic job of introducing.
that?
Uma Mahadevan.
Okay.
She's doing a fantastic job of introducing, books into every little panchayat library.
Oh.
Okay, so you do have, and you have Pratham, okay,
Right.
and which takes, I think, this extremely diverse set of titles.
And also the free library movement with Community Library Pro and Birsha Library and all of these places.
Yeah. So and the Pratham books are priced also very reasonably, about $50 a book. So and that does get books into people's hands, and you have read a book and stuff. So I think there is enough infrastructure if you know where to look for, so to speak. But it's up to the individual reader, what one picks up. Dominant culture is always the culprit.
Yeah.
Like we spoke in the previous session. You have Hollywood, then you have Bollywood, and then you have a hierarchy where you have Southern films.
Yeah.
But Southern films are ruling now.
Absolutely.
Right? So you need to get to a point where you have the Indian content, so to speak, come up,
Right.
bubble up, over this other stuff. And I think it's just
It's
a matter
happening.
of time.
Yeah. It's wonderful. Thank you very much.